Karibu tena. Thank you so much for coming for the Kampala Geopolitical Conference. And Rachel, why don't I start with you? Always an honor hosting you. Look, certainly the war in Ukraine has impacted and shifted the narratives around different economies across Africa and indeed across the world. Europe has been debating how they are going to survive the winter without gas from Russia. Innovations have come up. Indeed, I was talking to one of the scholars a few weeks ago, and he said, once we make it through the winter with all these different innovations, we will not need Russia again. In other words, they are adapting, they are evolving, they are coming to terms with it, and they have all united up in arms against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let me start with you. How has the war in Ukraine affected African economies, but perhaps putting a laser focus on Uganda? And perhaps you will also talk about what is our resilience strategy, or how do we bounce back? Rachel.
Thank you very much, Solomon, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, in your respective capacities. All protocol observed, especially for our biggest host, the VC. Coming back to your question, I think as you put it in your introductory remarks, by the time the war came, the global economy was already in a turmoil. So the war in Ukraine has actually just made things worse, disrupted economic activity further. Some of the economies were already starting to probably get back on their feet after the pandemic crisis that had brought down, created depression, and had brought down every single economy to their knees. If you talk about global consumer inflation, for example, many central banks are already responding to inflation that is already above what we normally know as normal inflation. In many countries, maybe in Uganda, it's just around 10%, but even that is much, much higher than what we've been used for, of 5%. But many other countries like Ghana, you have 50% inflation, and so on and so forth. Part of the drivers of that inflation has been the increasing commodity prices, but also the supply chain disruptions in, once you disrupt the supply, then you don't have sufficient supply, and so prices go up. But the increasing commodity prices had also started to, in recent months, had started falling in response to the slower global activity, but also as energy prices, as you know, OPEC sometimes does its magic and the prices change. So it had, there had been some negotiations and the prices of oil had started coming down. But inflation had already, started building in many economies. And this has led to almost across the board monetary tightening, and that has several implications to the markets, to the access to finance, to the prices of goods as well, much as you're trying to control, but also you're raising the cost of production, which becomes a vicious cycle. So these developments have definitely had implications for Africa. If I may go down to what is happening in Africa, commodity prices, the impact is varying. For example, some economies that are resource exporters are actually jubilating. their currencies are actually appreciating because they have a bonus, they have a boom. Prices are going up, they're exporting getting much more value out of their exports. For example, those oil exporters. But others that are oil importers or resource importers or commodity importers, like Uganda, are also facing the brunt because we saw that the oil prices actually soared up to a high of $120 dollars per barrel by June 2020. And that has been the highest since we last saw that level of prices in March 2012. So you can imagine over 20 years, over 10 years, this has never happened, but it was already happening. And of course, for those countries, as I mentioned, countries like in the Central African Republic, in the Central Africa, but also Western Africa, you see that there has been a contraction in inflation and also appreciation of currencies. But in others, like Uganda, we've seen, Uganda probably not that much, but countries like Ghana, the depreciation has been quite grave, like around 50%. In addition to that, we can't forget that there are weather shocks, and they've become quite more intense, more frequent, but also more intense. In the most recent past, the East African region, which includes Uganda, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, have been facing a drought, the worst in 4 decades, according to the experts. And this has been seen failing rains that has had implications for agriculture. So combining those shocks and also the mounting inflation pressures has raised fears on what could happen to other flows, like, for example, how much capital or foreign exchange can flow in the country as the spreads between the rates that are in the country and the rates that are out there, say in the US, in the advanced economies, are widening. As these spreads are widening, of course, there is fear that capital outflows might also increase. So what do we do as a way forward for Africa, facing a number of challenges, as has been highlighted through several fora and by several speakers? I think that policymakers need to strengthen the capacity to absorb shocks because they are going to become more frequent. This is not going to be the last, especially the weather shocks. They are going to become more frequent, so the capacity to absorb shocks needs to be strengthened while also seizing opportunities to generate inclusive and productivity-enhancing growth. I will go through like a few, if you allow me, some of these measures. The very first one, because we are in a time of instability, and you can't have growth if you have instability. So the very first, most critical issue is how to stabilize and overcome the inflation issue, or disease, as we call it. And this is a big challenge, because it's not an issue of just going to the market and stabilize. There are fears of stagflation, and that means very high inflation and very low growth, which central banks are facing. And so they have to be balancing between how do we actually manage inflation, but also not hurt the growth prospects that had started coming up after the pandemic.
And that's very tricky because, as central banks continue to raise interest rates, it means that also trickles down to the last businessman on whom the country depends on, to collect revenue and, to grow.
Exactly. That's why it's a major dilemma. But as the dilemma now seems to be shifting to let's first anchor inflation expectations to restore price stability, because the very foundation of even making sure that the businessman can grow, making sure that, inflation hurts the poor most. So even not doing anything and just sitting and allowing inflation, you're already hurting the poor. So managing inflation and making sure that it's controlled should be the first point of action. Different countries can do different things, because around the continent we have different monetary frameworks. Like, for example, cases like Uganda, where you have inflation targeting, probably the first point is to see to hike interest rates as has been done, so that you can get back into your inflation target. But a combination of restrictive monetary policy has to be made with a fiscal policy to be able to ensure that there is that balance. Then, for countries that have are not so much bent on inflation targeting, they can use a combination of restrictive monetary policy and fiscal policy and to ensure that they bring back the balance. Then for other countries like the Central African Monetary Union, the West African Monetary Union, where actually the exchange rate is fixed, then monetary policy has no role. Fiscal policy has to do all the work of stabilizing, and you can see how difficult that can be.
Yeah, Rachel, can I just hold you there?
Yeah.
As we continue? I gave Rachel some time because all of us, all across the world, it's not only Africa, these very, very tough decisions are being made by the central bank to manage imported inflation, including increasing interest rates to push back on inflation. Of course, the central bank has been hit back by, some economists that it's not the best decision to do, and that means that also translates to the cost at which you go to the bank to get money. So when the central bank increases the CBR, it means the interest rate at which the banks give you the money also goes up, and then everything becomes very tough. But yeah, Rachel, we'll come back to you on more of what we can do to really bounce back, including, by the way, leveraging the Africa Continental Free Trade area and the discussions happening at the continental level. We'll come back to that. But Professor Philip, let me come to you, because this is the Kampala Geopolitics conference. I thought we could speak some more politics here. Maybe let me use, so Prof, I wanted to get your thoughts on where does this war leave Africa as a continent in terms of the geopolitics of it. What we've seen is the West and indeed the Americans have put their foot forward against the war. In fact, Rishi Sunak today faced off with Lavrov in Indonesia at the G20. And of course, President Putin did not show up at the World Leaders Summit. But what we saw was the realignment of forces. Where do you fall, right? Where does your allegiance fall in this war? We saw that clearly at the UN, when the UN was voting against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the peak of the war, we saw Sergei Lavrov doing an African tour. They addressed a press conference with President Museveni, after which he headed for Ethiopia. So I just wanted to get your thoughts around where does this leave Africa? Where does this war leave Africa in terms of the geopolitics and also the alignment to the different allies?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation once again. I was here I think it was here last year, and we were talking about African integration. But specifically coming to your question, where does this leave Africa? A couple of things. Number one, there's very much of the fact that even Africa is not present in Bali at the G20. It's not a member. That tells you where we are as a continent. But since the beginning of the war, we've taken the position that this is not our war. Some countries, of course, and this can be reflected in how the conversation has taken place in the United Nations. Because of the deadlock in the Security Council, the matter was taken to the General Assembly. And so the General Assembly has been really the center of the conversation around the crisis in Ukraine, because Russia has a veto in the Security Council. Now, if you see the number of votes that have taken place in the General Assembly and the reaction of the African countries, the majority of the countries, of course, have been ambivalent. Others have, that means that they have abstained on some of the votes. But others have basically run away. They have not showed up at all, for one reason or the other. The only country which has put its foot down on the conflict supporting Russia is Eritrea. That could also be for the obvious reason that at least I got some inside information that Eritrean ambassador was threatened if he didn't vote for the resolution. And so he decided to say, okay, if you're threatening me, then I'm going to vote against. But that is Eritrea. So, but in the context of the politics, because we need to understand this very clearly, we take the view that this war has exposed the arrogance of some countries vis-a-vis the continent. And I think it's that arrogance which has hardened our position. Because the war is taken to be a global war. The European problems are global. African problems are local. This is a problem. And that's why some people have said, look, this is not our war. Let these people do their thing. For us, we shall watch. But the problem, of course, also has been that we have been affected. The ambivalence has not helped, because the question of inflation, the issues to do with food, issues to do with generally the whole conversation around, even when you talk about the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, the idea was that we should have started trading freely on the 1st of January 2022, which had been put back because of COVID. But it's only about 36 countries which have subscribed to the removal of internal borders in the context of free movement of goods, out of the 54 which have signed up to the AFCFTA. So we do have serious challenges, but I think we can rebound. And that also goes to show that we need to do more in terms of, as a continent, how can we suffer from food insecurities? Out of the Black Sea, I was reading recently that out of the Black Sea agreement on the exportation of grain, which was reached between the four entities, Russia, Ukraine, United Nations, and Turkey, the food prices now have fallen by about 16%. About 38 countries have imported something like about 9.7 million tons of food. So the idea here is that we should be, as Africans, we should be doing more in terms of, we have the opportunity to produce. When we come to the question of gas, the Europeans are scrambling for our gas now. With due respect to the Europeans who are here, Senegal, Mauritania, Mozambique. The problem is that we as Africans, we are not putting our house in order, because this really should have given us an opportunity. I normally argue that every time we talk about these matters, people talk about money. Oh, you know, Africa, we are poor. We are not poor. And that's why this notion of African solutions to African problems, you can't leave it on like that. We need African solutions to African problems with African money and African leadership. Because really this requires African leadership, whereby we produce, this is our opportunity now, produce the gas, put our house in order. All this rancor which I see around the continent, the issues in the Sahel, the issues in the Great Lakes region, M23 and all this kind of stuff that is going on. This is not very helpful for us. We should be now concentrating on making sure that we take advantage of the opportunity that this war has provided for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Kazibwe, let me turn to you. You've been closely following the war. We wanted to get your insights in terms of how the war has affected us as a continent, but also what are the key lessons that we learned from it, especially our positioning, you know. Because I know that you're an expert on international relations, so I will have Rachel do a lot of the economics and everything. I wanted to pick your mind on how this war has affected the continent in a political sense, and what that means for the relationships with our allies. You can.
No, in front. The speaker.
Thank you so much, Solomon. Good morning, everyone, and all protocol observed. I think it's important to find homegrown solutions, like my two colleagues have rightly said. But we also need to appreciate that the world has since been flattened, like Tom Friedman aptly observes in several of his major writings, that even when we choose to close ourselves like Bhutan did at one time, or as North Korea tries to do, we are living in a flattened world. So events happening elsewhere are bound to affect us. So as we look for homegrown solutions, we also have a role to play in advising the so-called civilized world in managing conflicts. Because today we are talking about Russia, tomorrow it might be a conflict between the West and China. And again, it is bound to affect us. So the outbreak of this war is, first of all, a classic example of the failure by the so-called civilized world in managing conflict. Because we all agree that this is the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War. So the systems created after the Second World War, including the UN, were hoped to be able to manage some of these realities of the world. We are seeing a complete failure in this war. Because, for starters, Ukraine and Russia are both to blame for this war, not on the one side. Ukraine chose to frustrate the Minsk agreement. Of course, it was unfair to Ukraine in many ways, but in my view, I think it would have been better to renegotiate that agreement rather than to raise the ante so high as it did. I also think Russia was ill-advised to start this war, thinking that the dynamics were going to be similar to the dynamics present in 2014 when it took Crimea. The reality on the ground has proved them wrong, and we all know that just after 1 month of the war, the Russian president modified the objectives of the war to liberation of Donbass. After the 1 month of the war, President Putin said, now our objective is to liberate Donbass. But we know that in that long speech he gave before the invasion, the objectives were certainly different. But the realities compelled him to change. So, in my view, Ukraine was ill-advised. Russia was ill-advised. But I also think that the West had a role to play here in forestalling this war. Let's look at what happened after the Second World War. Japan were defeated, but the West found a way of dealing with them. Why wouldn't they deploy the same approach in dealing with Russia after the end of the Cold War? Because the failure to do so pushed Russia to the corner to the extent that every time the Western world thinks of something, Russia reads mischief. So sometimes it's just perception, sometimes it is real. But we have seen the end result of the failure to manage these conflicts. Because I think it shouldn't end with Russia. Other conflicts are bound to happen. But how can we forestall those conflicts? Because at the end of the day, are going to affect all of us, including Africa and Uganda in particular. Now, getting back to Africa and how we have been affected, I won't go into the economics because my colleagues have adequately addressed that matter. But look at the conflicts and how they have worsened on the African continent. You know what has happened in Mali, the regime change in Burkina Faso. So we have moved full circle and gone back to the Cold War era, where, I mean, you might think that it's a foreign war, but the war is directly ours. In fact, in my view, I do not think that African nations that have abstained in the UN General Assembly are just ambivalent. They are not. What looks like ambivalence speaks volumes. It explains the complicated times in which they are living. African leaders are trying to play a delicate balance. And it affects us in many ways, because sometimes an African leader might even walk away from a very good deal with Russia or the West just because you think you might hurt the feelings of the other. So overzealous, being overly cautious is one of the implications of this war. So African leaders are overly cautious. And as a result, they are going to walk away from some of the deals that would be good for the African continent. So we are being affected in that way. The conflicts are going to worsen, because if you look at events in Mali, events in Burkina Faso, the global powers have taken sides, have clearly taken sides. But who is at the turn of the wheel? The English people say, as two elephants tangle, it's the grass that gets entangled. So we are the grass being entangled now in this conflict. So the indecision on the part of African leaders is also a ripple effect of this war. The conflicts that are worsening are also a result of this war. So I think it is very important for us as a continent to think about homegrown solutions and implement them. The issue of being able to produce enough food, because we have much better conditions than Russia, than Ukraine, than most of these countries where we import our food. And most of the grains that we talk about have over time become our staples. There are people here who will eat chikomando day in, day out. So they are our staples as we speak.
Yeah.
But
can I just come in there? Because earlier on you had mentioned a point. Let me ask, does Africa have anything that it can do to put an end to the war in Ukraine? Or, like you said, it's not our war, we shouldn't get concerned. Do we have anything as a continent? Because whilst the world is really getting concerned about what's happening, lives have been lost, millions, families broken, homes destroyed, businesses gone down. Like you said, the world has been flattened. Does Africa as a continent have a place in pushing back against the war or putting an end to the war?
I think in international relations and politics, there's what they call idealism and realism. The reality of the matter is that our support in ending this war is limited. It's limited. Is limited, as a matter of fact, because, it's a high-tech war if you followed the war. So where do we fall? So if we want to become big players in the future, because I'm saying this is not the last war we are going to have. The other time, China was being provoked, and President Joe Biden is just trying to manage the situation, if you followed in the last few hours. So what do you bring on the table to be able to influence? I think that's what we have got to do. Countries like Indonesia were not powerful 50 years ago. We are not able to influence. I mean, you said in your introductory remarks here that Putin is not attending the conference. But do you think it's because he just did not want to attend? People like Widodo put pressure on him because he was going to be sidelined if he was going to attend. But where does he get that power? It is because they have reorganized their houses to be powerful, to be able to influence. I think those are some of the things we've got to focus on. If we put our houses in order and we are able to speak and be heard. Let me give you an example relating to China and Taiwan. One of the reasons as to why, despite the fact that China was provoked, it wasn't willing to rush into a war with Taiwan, it's because the microchips that China uses in its tech industries, 85% come from that territory called Taiwan. So if you start a war today, what does that mean to your tech factories, including factories that manufacture weapons? So one of the insurance policies that Taiwan has bought is to be able to develop its technology, it's to be able to sufficiently produce for itself so that it can speak and it can be heard. So I think that's what we have got to do in Africa, and we have the potential. For example, we have the potential to be able to produce food and supply the world market because we have everything. The other countries are doing it artificially. For us, God has endowed us with the natural beauty to do that. We haven't prioritized it. Many African nations have signed agreements and accords compelling us to increase our budgets on agriculture. But we are not able to implement them. We have deliberately refused to implement them. So that's why we keep importing food. For example, if we were big producers of food at the international market, African Union's voice would be critical in matters like this. Because you see, if Ukraine and Russia are locked out, Russia's locked out because of the sanctions. For 5 months, Ukraine was locked out because it couldn't use its ports to export food. So if we could become a substitute, in that case it would mean we would have a stronger voice, because in that case, we would also be able to say, if you don't do A, B, C, and D, we won't also be able to supply you the food. But now, what are we able to offer to influence? Because you can't just influence because you're a sovereign state. On many occasions, African countries say, we are sovereign, we are sovereign. But sovereign in what? That's the key point.
Wow, I think that's one of my take-homes from here. What can we do to actually call the shots? In other words, how do we reorganize our houses to be on the table where we can influence? Wow, quite interesting. Thank you very much. Rachel, certainly there are opportunities for us. Dr. Ken was talking about how we need to leverage, for example, on agriculture. When the deal was signed between Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine, and indeed the UN, to allow Ukraine export grain via the Black Sea, one of the pressures was that Africa was, dying of hunger because, in Somalia, and therefore there was a food shortage. It certainly had a lot to do with destabilizing the supply, the food chain. Before we knew it, about 2 weeks ago, Kenya was downloading about 300,000 tons from St. Henry, which is indeed one of the vessels that Ukraine uses to take out grain. This is an opportunity that we would have used as a continent. Because like Dr. Kazibwe is saying, we have the fertile soils, we have the rains, and therefore we could have concentrated more on perhaps agriculture to have a solid say at the international global level. What key lessons do we learn, and what can we do better as a continent? And perhaps how do we bounce back? You are still also talking about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I like the idea of fighting the war by responding to the question of how do we get our voice on the table or heard. From my perspective, the best way to hear your voice is actually to become self-sustaining, economically empowered. If you are not, then you are going to remain a beggar, dependent on other continents, on other sources of produce. As you said, there was even an extra effort to see that grain is gotten out of a war zone so that people don't starve. And yet, day in, day out, we are talking about Africa, in particular countries like Uganda, having the potential to be food baskets. And this has been a song ever since I started studying economics. It has been a song of Uganda can be a food basket for Africa, but it has never been realized. So what exactly is going on? Why can't we invest in this area and actually produce the food? We have, where you're supposed to be producing, you have land wrangles, which means land policies are not actually supportive of agriculture. When you look at things that other people do to actually raise production and raise productivity of agriculture, things like fertilizers, you see the level of use of, improved inputs into agriculture is very low in Uganda. And you wonder why, of all, if you you have a very high potential, why aren't these things happening so that you can actually raise the potential? Coming back to, my broader fiscal issues or macro issues, when you look at what actually is going into the budget to support agriculture, it's also very much questionable, because much as when you invest in infrastructure, will also be indirectly supporting agriculture. But there is not deliberate effort to merge what infrastructure is being invested in against agricultural productivity and making that particular effort to raise agricultural productivity. So I think we have a lot of work to do on the continent, because the potential, as we know, as we see, or we've been saying all along, the potential is there, but we haven't been tapping into it. Let me come to the issue of Uganda in particular. How do we boost the agri-food industry in the country? I think one of the issues is to see how do we enhance productivity of the primary production, and how do we access and allow, also encourage adoption of high quality agricultural inputs. This would require, first of all, the regulatory environment, which as of now is very weak, the land tenure system, and the input quality, and implementing the ongoing research. Because evidence is there that when you look at what is going on the research plots of scenario or whatever, the yields are high, but these are not transformed into the farms, the actual farms. So what exactly is going on between the research bodies and the farmers that is not allowing that transfer of knowledge to be incorporated into the farmers so that we can raise productivity? And given the increasing climate variability and the pest outbreaks, moreover, these two are actually related. You may think the insect is just growing and coming to eat plants, but it's also related to the issue of climate in Uganda. So it's vital to increase the resilience of agricultural systems and rural livelihoods. And that means that farmers need to be equipped with climate-smart land use approaches, and the way they use water, the way they use the soils, the way they use their livestock management practices, irrigation, infrastructure, and access to disaster risk information. Because all that will help the farmers then be able to manage the shocks that are coming on board and be able to produce more. Then there is the value chain issue. If I've been producing matoke or maize, how does it get to the level of, which process does it go through to the dining table? And how do we tap into that to make sure that actually maybe the farmer or more people within the country are actually earning out of that instead of just exporting the raw materials to the rest, to outside the country. So reaping the full benefit of the sector will require strengthening the institutional processes and coordinating with the different stakeholders, because as we know, we have so many stakeholders within the sector, and each one is coming up with a different ideas and implementing in their own silos, and also making sure that the public investments that I've talked about are actually providing the public goods that are required to enhance agricultural productivity.
Thanks, Rachel. That is, you know, I was in Kasese over the weekend, and I saw the power of concentrating on supporting farmers. I went to the Mubuku irrigation scheme, thousands and thousands of acres there, and farmers, organizing farmers to grow. I don't know, Honorable, if you've been to Mubuku irrigation scheme, amazing work. Government has invested heavily, indeed with the support of development partners. The Water for Production under the Ministry of Water has done a very beautiful, irrigation system that supplies water throughout the entire year to farmers, and they're well organized, heavy production. And Mubuku is actually the food basket of that whole region, stretching through to the Toro Kingdom and indeed the Rwenzururu Kingdom, and supplying food there. Amazing stuff happening there, and I think that's what you're talking about. In fact, they have subsidies with fertilizers. They're quite well organized, and I was just thinking to myself, why can't government do the same? I'm being short time, but let me come to Professor Kasaija. What we have seen because of the war is the people who used to give us money for development or development aid have now rechanneled money towards, ending the war and supporting the war. And that means we have a budget deficit. And that means that comes back to us to look for money to be able to support our budgets, and that then we go into heavy borrowing. You saw what happened last week when the Ministry of Finance issued out a call for bankers to apply and present proposals to give government money over 1 trillion shillings. What does the future look like? What can we do in such a state?
No, we just need to mobilize internal resources and try to bridge the gap. And again, we go back to, let me give you a very practical example. Ethiopia started building the Grand Renaissance Dam in 2012. They never floated, they never went to the World Bank, they never went to the IMF. This is internally generated money. That dam, which is the biggest dam in Africa today, producing 5,150 megawatts. Now, if you understand electricity, 5,150 megawatts is a lot of power. And this is internally generated money, $4.3 billion. That's what that dam is, including prisoners. In fact, I was told that prisoners also contributed to the building of the dam. So which means that we do have internal resources that we can raise. The problem is the trust deficit. Tell me, how many governments in Africa, or how many governments in Africa are ready to be trusted by their people to give them money? And we have seen it even here. I mean, the question of the COVID money. I hear, even myself, the Vice Chancellor, we raised money in this university. But what happened to the COVID money? So the question is the trust. There is a trust deficit. The Ethiopian people are ready to trust their government, that the government is going to spend their money well, and they'll account for it. So that's why many of us are very reluctant to give to give money. But really the internal resources are here. Now, to put this in perspective, of course, yes, there are difficulties everywhere. Even development partners, even donors have difficulties because this war has affected everybody. So wherever the sources of money have become very, 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 very scarce. So, but what does that mean for us? The budget of the entire African Union for 2022 is $651 million. $651 million. That is for 54 countries in Africa. How much is Elon Musk worth? You just think about it. How much is Elon Musk? So the 54 countries, and that goes back to the question of this sovereignty which Dr. Kazibwe is talking about. The issue of sovereignty. Sovereignty what? What is sovereignty? What is it? If a whole state, if a whole continent of 54 countries, 1.2 billion people, has a budget of $651 million, and then you have an individual who has more than $600 billion, so who is more important? So these are the things that we need to write. These are the things that we need to write. So even when we are arguing about this whole thing about, dates and sovereign, sovereign, I attend these meetings in African Union and I see how presidents arrive. Presidential jets, first ladies, first sons, first daughters, first this, first rubbish. So the thing is, my problem is, how do we reconcile this, by the way, as Africans? I'm actually amazed. And you look and you stand there, you say, but how can these people behave like this? How do they behave like this? So the point you are raising is, yes, the sources of money have become very scarce. So what do we need to do? We need to look internally. We need to harm, but that means that we have to have trust in the government. If you don't have trust in the government, tell me. You raise money for COVID, they steal it. You raise money for Ebola, they steal it. You raise money for you, they steal it. So what do you do? So there's no way how I'm going to spend my money. I'm going to contribute any of my coins. And with due respect, the Vice Chancellor is here. I will never give back my money because I want accountability. I want accountability. So the more the money sources become scarce, the more we'll get into problems. And that's why we have to go and borrow commercially. Of course, borrowing commercial as a country, it becomes very, concessional loans are no longer there. 1, 2, 3, 4% is not there. So we're talking about 15%, 20%. So you're working for these guys who you're getting the money from. And I think that's why our economies are really in trouble. But you look at our potential. I'll just give you just a small example here. It is estimated that the amount of wealth that is still in the ground in DRC is about $2.4 trillion. What has not been exploited? So in form of diamonds, gold, coltan, tungsten, niobium, all these very rare minerals are found in the DRC. But look at the DRC. It cannot even pay for its own subscription into the African Union. It is classified, it is in tier 3. But if you don't know, I will tell you, there are 3 tiers in Africa. You have the first 6, the next 10, and then the rest. The first 6 is Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, Morocco, Angola, and South Africa. Those are the first 6. Then you have the next 10. In there you have Ghana, Kenya. Uganda is the last on that, on the number 10 there. And then you have all the others. What they call all the others, tier 3. So tell me, and you look at some of these countries, these are people. Look, Sir, what can I say? No, let me just stop here.
Wow, thank you. You know, while you were saying that, as going back to how we spent over 2 billion shillings to buy 2 cars for the speaker and the deputy speaker, in the thick of it, that's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. This is what I'm telling you. And it's not only happening here, it's happening elsewhere. It's not only, well, in Uganda is an exception. Here, oh my goodness. Here, even when things are so difficult, as we are being told to tighten, my belt is so tight, but the others are loosening. So it just does not make sense. I can tell you, I go to my village and it just does not make sense. And say, Kasaija, you're talking about these things, African. What is wrong with you? So, Sarwanja, you live in this country, we all live in this country. But I've given you the example of Ethiopia. The Ethiopians, despite the fact that, well, it's the second biggest country in Africa in terms of population, but they were able to rise. They floated a sovereign bond. Each one bought into, everyone is an owner of that dam. This dam is going to produce electricity, which they intend to sell to Egypt, to sell to Europe, to sell to Yemen, to sell to Uganda, to sell everywhere. It is internally raised money. Just a small thing. 2 turbines. The 2 turbines, there are 13 turbines on Grand Renaissance Dam. 2 turbines are producing 700 megawatts. What is the biggest dam in Uganda? Karuma. How much does it produce? 600 megawatts. There in Ethiopia, only 2 turbines are producing 700. And it costs us so much in this country. So you can imagine. So it's a question also, and we go back to that animal. Of course, we don't want to talk about it here. It's a question of leadership. It's about leadership. Because if you Meles Zenawi, who had the presence of mind to say, look, if we are going to develop Ethiopia, we need to have electricity. And that's why he started that, notwithstanding all the pressures that has come under, or which Ethiopia has come under from everywhere. But that dam right now, as I speak, is 90% complete. 90%. So you can imagine what it can do. If we had so many other dams which are the same, what will it do? So this is what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that we can raise resources on this continent. We don't need to go anywhere else. But because of the question of leadership, that's why we are what we are.
Thank you. And that's why the AFCTA hasn't taken off.
Absolutely. AFCFTA potentially is supposed to create about 3.2 trillion. $3.2 trillion. This is the size of the economy of Germany. It's the size of the economy of Germany. It's bigger than the size of the economy of South Korea, which is about 1.9, and Brazil. So, but where are we? 54 countries went to Kigali. They signed up to this CFTA. 36 are supposed to be implementing. Even Uganda was supposed to be implementing, by the way. I don't know how far we have gone to remove the internal barriers. Every time I move around, I see, oh, Kenyan goods have been prevented from entering Uganda. But we are supposed to be in a common market. The conceptual understanding of a common market is that you have free movement of goods, people, and services, and right of residence. So why are we saying that we're in a common market? These are some of the things which we need to discuss. But, of course, when we raise these matters, oh, you see, you are in Ivory Tower, and well, the Ivory Tower.
The other day, the president was very mad with academicians. Professor, you heard him saying that, where are the professors to advise us? Where are the economists to advise us? And he broke down the numbers, the global numbers, the money from coffee, and how much comes to Africa and how much comes to Uganda, and how the professors are not advising him right. You just at the Ivory Tower. Well, I'm sure that you always put out these things. And
I hope you're addressing the professor now.
No, Professor Nwange always puts up these things to him. But thanks. Dr. Kazibwe, you have the final say at this. The war in Ukraine has brought people to rethink about their energy situation. The West is really, reinventing, and we're also here celebrating about our oil, which is going to be pumped out of the ground. We expect the first dropout by 2023, and investing a lot of money, about $10 billion in the economy, pumping out about 6.5 billion barrels of crude oil. Are you optimistic about the future of the continent in terms of our energy supplies? And what lessons do we learn from the war in Ukraine, especially around the areas of energy?
I'll get to your question in a moment, but first, I wish to reiterate, just like Professor stated, in the short term, we can do internal mobilization, but you've got to work on the trust and the perception of the population. 2, cutting wasteful and unnecessary expenditure. It can save us a lot in the short term. It's not alien to the African DNA. Magufuli did it in 6 years. In fact, at his funeral, President Chakwera said, this man has done things we thought were foreign. So that's possible in the short run. In the longer term, I think we need to focus our energies on agriculture. Therein lies our potential. But for commercial agriculture to thrive all over the world, the governments must hold it like a baby. Because by nature, agriculture is susceptible to losses. So if the government doesn't hold it like a baby, it's going to be left to peasants. And you know peasants farm hand to mouth. But if you want to engage in agriculture that is going to turn around this country, the government must be heavily involved. And that's the practice world over. Let me give you an example. One time I was doing research in the state of Oklahoma in the US. It's one of those states that engage in a lot of agriculture. And I had an interview with the person in charge of crop insurance. You see, America taught us liberalization. But when you study their agriculture, it's as if liberalization does not exist in the United States. Microcredit institutions that provide monies to farmers are heavily subsidized by the state. Insurance companies that provide services to farmers are heavily subsidized by the state. So in my interviews with the person who was in charge of crop insurance in Oklahoma, he told me that for every $1 a farmer pays to this farm annually, we return 1.2. So he told me, which means it's not a profitable business. But why do we still engage in this type of insurance? It's because the American government heavily subsidizes us. And I asked why. Then he retorted that because food security is very important for this country called the United States. That's why the 2% of the population, between 2 to 5% of the population in the US engages in agriculture. But it's able to produce food and even provide food to World Food Program that comes to Uganda and even exports food to countries like Japan and elsewhere. But it's not unique to the US. Go to Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, and many other countries. However, for us in many African nations, we think that farmers can survive like other business people. Agriculture can't thrive that way. Getting to the point of oil. First of all, oil is a deeply eatable commodity. So it's not going to be here forever. So if we all put our focus on oil, we are in trouble. Secondly, history has shown us that if you're not transparent with the management of oil, it turns into a curse. So as we think about opening the first tap in 2025 as we are being promised, the issue of transparency must be managed pretty well. The moment it is not, oil will turn out to be a curse. If you want to understand in detail how terrible oil can be in an emerging economy, I invite you to read that book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat.
Isn't the world flat? A round of applause to my panel. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Professor Philip, thank you very much. Dr. Kenneth Kazibwe, thank you very much. And Rachel Sebude, thank you very much. Please go and take your seats. I hope we learned something, right? My take home from today is...
maybe, Solomon, before they leave, we could just get just 1 or 2 questions from the audience, because once we move on, We may not be able to get those questions. I'm just giving this part only 5 minutes. Help me with the microphone, please. There's a gentleman over here. Make your question brief. Let us know who you are and who the question is directed to, please. All right.
Thank you so much. I'm Nelson Kakumba. I'm a fourth-year law student. My question goes to Dr. Samuel Kazibwe. Doctor, you say that for us to get something out of oil, there must be transparency. Dr. Samuel Kazibwe, you as a senior journalist, for the years you've been in Uganda, are you sure Ugandan government can really be accountable and transparent to that effect, or we just consider that as a curse for Uganda? Thank you so much.
Let's get the lady at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Liz Nyanzi, a student at CHUS, School of Social Sciences, pursuing a degree in social sciences. My question would go to all the panelists right now. Thank you for addressing us. But my question would be about implementation of what we have always been talking and our leaders have always been addressing. Because we know and we trust ourselves with the knowledge that we are in a situation and in a country where nothing can be implemented. And the fact that the oil business or the oil initiative is actually a curse and has been a curse and is not going to change. And this project that is ongoing by the government of Uganda should actually be stopped, and the government of Uganda should invest in agriculture, which is what we have as Uganda. It is our pride. So my question to you will be, how much are we going to implement the suggestions our panelists have given today in Uganda for an example? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks. Are those enough? 2? Okay, great. First, let me create some hope that Uganda is a member of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which is a global body that pushes, well, these are facts, right? The way the oil and gas industry works does not work on feelings. There are international agencies that you have to subscribe to and you have to push for it. It actually took 3 years for Uganda to be admitted at the EITI, and there's a secretariat here that is supposed to report to an international body about the update and progress of how the processes are done. I just wanted to give you some information, but to say the least, that question wasn't mine, it was to Dr. Kazibwe. Over to you. And to the panel, yeah. So,
I think the answer is, okay, thank you. I think the answer is pretty simple. We all know that matters related to this oil for over a decade have been shrouded in mystery. It's not a moot point. It's good you're a law student. It's not a moot point at all. However, governments are like human beings. They work well under pressure. So the onus is for all of us to put our government on pressure to ensure that it does the best. I'm not among those who oppose the exploration of this oil, no. However, I believe that transparency is important. Transparency is important because if we do not do so, it will turn out to be a curse. Let me give you an example. In Kenya, the just ended government of Uhuru Kenyatta refused to release the contracts for the SGR. But now, throughout the campaign, the population put a lot of pressure on government, the outgoing and the incoming. So the incoming government promised that once voted into power, this document is going to be laid bare. Just last week, the new minister for transport published the document. And it's the newest debate in Kenya, and Kenya is never going to be the same again. So it gets back to us, the population, that leaders mismanage things because we have allowed them to do so.
Do you want to say something? Okay.
Solomon, there was a question for the lady at the back. I think it's important we get it.
Okay, thank you. Let me just add to what the doctor has mentioned about transparency, but also what Solomon mentioned, that this EITI initiative, which is at least a development in the right direction, and which we should embrace and make sure that we also, as a population, add to that to request for accountability. But there are also other issues, because managing oil does not just come on the plate. You have to have the institutions. For example, we've just been talking about how the fiscal policy, the expenditures are not, some of them are not going into the right places. So if you are going to multiply the number of, four-wheel drives and whatever high-level vehicles, and the number of parliamentarians that we have, and the number of districts, and the number of public expenditure just raising, then we should know that oil monies are going to be wasted. The other additional point is, if we get those resources, and the question is, where are they invested? Someone mentioned agriculture, that's one area. But wherever they are invested, we have, Uganda still has a very bad way of managing its public investments, such that the return on the investments are so low. So if